Welcome back to another Kerbal Space Program video, ladies and gentlemen, and in today's Kerbal Space Program video we will once again be returning to my series Life on Laythe, the series in which I endeavour to colonize all aspects of Joule's wateriest moon to unlock all of its secrets. In our story so far, we have sent a dragonfly-esque quadcopter to survey the landscapes and oceans of Laythe. We then sent an orbiting space station to establish some sort of orbital presence. We then deployed a submersible ocean base to, you guessed it, the oceans of Laythe to analyze the liquid there. Then we sent a VTOL tilt-wing flying laboratory there as well, but now we need to establish a more permanent presence on the lands of Laythe. Enter the subject matter of today's video, which you can see being constructed on your screens right now. That is the Laythe surface base. Now, when it came to this base's design, there are a few things that I wanted to definitely incorporate. I wanted it to have, ample internal crew capacity, which I think this definitely does with those 3 Mark III passenger bays, but I also wanted it to have an onboard laboratory, all of the science experiments units, as well as an ore refinery, drilling rig, ore tank, etc, etc. And when it comes to incorporating all of those things into a single base, I, like many other Kerbal Space Program players I'm sure, tends to fall into the same sort of habits of just designing bases in the exact same way. You find a formula that works, and then it works, why deviate from this? So in the past, and including in the first season of Life on Laythe, I typically build the laboratory structure in the center of the base, and then around it I add some spokes like a wagon wheel, and at the end of each of these spokes I add like another tower containing each little section, be it the engineering block, which has the refinery, the science block that has all the experiments. But I thought, you know what, let's try and make things a little bit more different this time around. So I've tried to create a slightly more interesting looking base. It's a bit more monolithic than my other bases, like it's all just one part of one big unit, and I think it looks quite cool. I've never built a base that looks like this. One of the kind of limitations when it comes to placing the laboratory on surface bases in this game is the fact that the lab has to be assembled vertically if you want the IVA view to match how it's placed. Like, the actual inside of the lab is a vertical structure, and the Kerbals use a ladder to ascend and descend it, which is a shame. It would be nice if the lab had some sort of IVA toggle mode, so you could either have it in a horizontal orientation or indeed in a vertical orientation, just to enable slightly more diversity when it comes to designing surface bases or, big rovers. But I think this is still a good compromise, and in fact, I quite like how this came out. We've got a nice, it looks a little bit like an Arctic base. I was having a look at some Arctic base designs on Google Images when coming up for like a basic design for this thing. I think it looks pretty cool. We've got that nice, long passenger bay, and then we've got that big tower where scientists can do all their experiments, and at the very top we've got that crow's nest cockpit to, I guess just stand and observe like Batman over the landscape of Laythe. I lost track of where that tangent was going quite some time ago, guys. Anyway, you may have noticed one weird little feature, and that is that rather than using landing legs on this thing, I decided to use the big alligator hinges, just because I've never done this before, and I had a bit of an idea. And that is to do with one of the more difficult aspects of building surface bases in Kerbal Space Program, in that there are very, very, very few areas in this game that are completely flat, as in terrain-wise. And when you've got a few sort of peninsulas and mesas on Kerbin, and you've got the Minmus flats, but other than that, there aren't really any other flat spots in this game. Everything is kind of like a little bit wonky. The terrain is very, very rarely perfectly flat. Now, some people get around this problem with Laythe by just landing on the poles, which do have lots and lots of big flat tundras, but I didn't want to build this base on the poles. In fact, I wanted to build this base on the island that I established last week, Lowne Island. It's a little spit of land I found on Laythe, and it's not got its own biome, so I planted a flag on the island and declared it a nation of Lowne Aerospace and called it Lowne Island. So that is where I would like to build our base. And Lowne Island, whilst it's not too hilly, it's certainly less mountainous than other islands on Laythe. It is still nonetheless fairly, it has the terrain is of the undulating variety. I don't know, I'm trying to find synonyms for mountainous. Anyway, bringing me back to why I've got those alligator hinges. So I thought we can have the alligator hinges deploy at various levels of extension. That was probably a better way of wording that sentence. Now I've just said it out loud. But basically, I'm going to have the alligator hinges open at different angles along the length of the base to try and keep the base level despite the not level terrain that it is resting on. That's my plan. Will it work? You'll have to just wait and see, dear viewers. We've got to get that viewer retention. And trust me, the landing of this thing on Laythe is one of the most difficult things I've ever done. And that will unfold before your eyes as we get there. There were a few other hitches along the way, particularly en route to Jewel, which I'll talk about again when we're en route to Jewel. Now we must move along, ladies and gentlemen, to the construction of this base's rover. I've had a lot of requests to build a rover in life on Laythe, and you know, rovers, they don't really have that much utility on Laythe because most of the moon is just water, so I didn't want to just make a dedicated rover video where we build some gigantic thing that can realistically only travel like a kilometer before it runs into the sea. So I thought instead of making this gigantic overkill rover, we'll just make this little one that can, you know, travel around Lowne Island between various structures or flags or vehicles or anything like that. I mean, at the moment, obviously, there's only going to be one surface structure on Lowne Island, but that might change in a future episode, and obviously at some point in the not too distant future I would like to have some sort of transportation system that will link the surface to the orbiting space station. So, you know, if we have a plane or rocket or whatever, I haven't really thought it through what the vehicle is going to be, but if that lands and it doesn't land right next to the surface base, then this rover can transport Kerbals between the surface base and the surface to space transportation vehicle. And obviously, in addition to all the aforementioned features I've just gone through, this rover also has every single science unit available to us, so we can do a thorough analysis of every corner of Lowne Island. And it also has, you know, the beefy big wheels. I mean, obviously not the gigantic ones, but these are pretty good wheels nonetheless, so it can go at a pretty good pace, and it's quite well balanced. It doesn't flip too easily because it's got a nice wide stance and its center of gravity isn't too high, and it's got a nice, you know, 2-seat Kerbal capacity. I'm quite happy with how that rover turned out, to be honest. Now, as you can see, I've kind of split the base up a little bit by lopping off that big tower and strapping it to one side via a docking port, just because I had to think about how this thing was going to launch. I kind of wanted to do it in one launch just to make things as streamlined as possible, to make sure this video didn't go on for too long. So I thought it might be a little bit difficult to launch with that giant tower sticking out to the side. So I thought the best way of setting this base up for a launch would be having the tower at the end and then launching the whole thing vertically. So we're going to flip it on its side in just a second and build the booster underneath that cupola module you can see at the end, and we'll be doing that very shortly. Now, I've got those 4 vector engines that sort of stack around the base. Those are there for a couple of reasons. The main reason is so they can provide a last little puff of thrust just before we touch down to make sure this thing is touching the surface of Laythe as slow as possible. Obviously, the bulk of our deceleration is going to be done with those parachute modules, but it's always nice to have a little bit of extra kick right before you touch the surface, especially with something like this, which doesn't necessarily have the best crash tolerance in the world. You can see me, by the way, just very quickly lining up the lower booster with this craft's center of mass to make sure that we get it's easily controllable as we perform our burns with the lower stage. Anyway, as I was saying, those vector engines will assist with the landing deceleration, but it will also help us with, you know, fine-tuning our trajectory when it comes to landing, because Lowne Island is very, 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 very small, and I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but this thing is not very aeroplane-like. It doesn't glide particularly well. It's very, very hard to get it to go where you want it to go whilst it's, you know, tumbling through the atmosphere on atmospheric entry. So those vector engines will just help give us a little bit more control in terms of where we land. Ultimately, it is going to be a case of doing a lot of trial and error, and that's mostly error as well. But regardless, they will help us a little bit. As you can see, construction of the rocket that'll get this thing to Laythe is well underway. We have some nuclear engines to propel us during our interplanetary burns. You can see we've got those side tanks there. They're there for a couple of reasons. Firstly, they provide some structural integrity to the payload because they act as a sort of scaffolding structure that we can strut the surface base to. But as you can see, they are also a separate stage and they feed into the central core with a fuel line, meaning that they'll drain before any of the other fuel tanks do, which means that we can stage them and leave the rest of our ship fully fueled whilst those tanks are empty, thus optimizing our ship's mass and giving us a little bit of extra delta V. And don't worry, we won't be leaving them drifting in space. We'll be dropping them at a point where they'll just burn up back into Kerbin's atmosphere. But we can talk about that when we get to that part in the mission. As for the construction of the rest of this rocket, it's nothing too exciting really. It's just a bunch of the gigantic making history fuel tanks with a bunch of engines attached to them to lift this thing into orbit. It's a fairly standard rocket configuration. For our main stage, we have a cluster of the F1 engines at the bottom, and I've attached them to a fairing base. A lot of people say, why don't you attach them to an engine plate rather than a fairing base? And I like attaching to the fairing bases for the first stage because the fairing base can be made to be black, which blends in a little bit better with the black band at the bottom of this fuel tank, and also fairing bases weigh a little bit less than engine plates, so we get a little bit of extra delta V by using a fairing base rather than an engine plate. Obviously this isn't true for mid stages like this one, where it makes more sense to use an engine plate because the fairing pieces will need to have a separate decoupler adding to them, and at that point then it makes more sense to use an engine plate. But for the first stage, where obviously nothing is going to be underneath it and you don't need a decoupler, I like using the fairing bases. And here we are on the launch pad, and off we go into the air. Now, I've got two of the gigantic SRBs, I believe they're called the Clydesdale boosters, helping to kick this thing off the pad. Without them, our thrust-weight ratio is too low to achieve flight. It's not the most efficient way of building rockets in Kerbal Space Program. It's far more efficient to use liquid-fueled engines because they're a bit more fuel efficient, and obviously they come with the added benefit of being able to have crossfeed, to have asparagus or onion staging, and also it's nice to be able to have the you can change the throttle of them. But I don't know, it looks cool, and that's pretty much my only rationale for using the Clydesdale boosters here. It just looks very cool to use solid rocket boosters. It looks very SLS-esque if the SLS developed a gigantic bloated fairing like this rocket. And there go the SRBs there. I used a bunch of Separatrons to make sure they would definitely be pulled clear of the central core, and they were, so good. And now we can just continue with our gravity turn, I guess. So just very, very gradually tipping closer and closer towards the prograde marker. I am going for a fairly steep ascent profile just here because once this lower stage runs out, we'll be using the much lower thrust skipper engine. So I want to put as much space between us and our apoapsis as possible to give those skipper engines plenty of time to get us accelerated to orbital velocity. But now we're pretty much through the thickest parts of the atmosphere. Thrust-weight ratio is less of an issue now because there's virtually no air resistance to fight against. So we're just going to coast our way up into space, gradually tipping towards our prograde marker. Now you may have noticed in the build time lapse that originally I had a Rhino engine for this stage. However, when it came to testing it, the Rhino engine just wasn't really powerful enough, hence why I went back and replaced it with 4 skipper engines, which together have a marginally higher thrust to weight ratio than a single Rhino engine does, and their ISP is fairly comparable as well. Now once we reach 55 kilometers, I think that's a safe point at which we can say the air is pretty much non-existent, so we can deploy our fairing to shed some of our mass and give us a little bit more delta V to work with as we finalize our ascent into Kerbin Orbit. We're not going to orbit using this lower stage because I don't want it to get left stuck in space, so once we've got our desired apoapsis, we're going to just drop it so that it cruises back into the atmosphere and burns up, and then we can use the nuclear engines to do the last puff to get us circularized into orbit. Now, I noticed there were some Kerbals inside the base rover just here, and I thought it might be a bit cruel to make them spend the entire journey from Kerbin to Laythe inside that rover module, so I quickly EVA'd them across to the main surface base. I know I could have right-clicked the rover cockpit and pressed transfer crew and just made them transfer across internally, but that wouldn't really make sense since there is no internal corridor that links the rover and the main service base. Although, just for the sake of realism, we'll just get them on an EVA to do that transfer. And now we can just time warp up to our apoapsis to perform our 55-ish meter per second burn to get ourselves into a stable Kerbin orbit. And then we can think about planning our journey to Laythe. Now, I did launch at a Laythe transfer window, well, a dual transfer window to be more accurate. So it's going to be fairly simple to plot our maneuver node to get an encounter with the big green giant. And we can go to the map screen and do that now. So we're going to drag out our prograde marker, make sure our vector goes ahead of Kerbin so we get our apoapsis nice and high. And then I'm just going to drag it around until we get a dual encounter. I didn't even bother setting it as our target, actually, because Joul's gravity well is so massive that it's very, very trivial to get an encounter with it from Kerbin. And then we're going to execute a roughly 1 kilometer per second burn to get ourselves to the very edge of Kerbin's sphere of influence, just beyond Minimus's height, but it's very crucial that we don't fully escape, because you may remember during the build time lapse that I want to be able to deploy those side tanks at a point where they will re-enter Kerbin's atmosphere and not be left in space. As I mentioned, these tanks are set to drain before any of the other tanks as well, so my epic plan is that we could do this roughly 1 kilometer per second burn to raise our apoapsis to the edge of the Kerbin system, and then once we reach our apoapsis, we can do a retrograde burn to drop our periapsis to a point within Kerbin's atmosphere, and then we can stage those now empty side tanks. This will optimize our ship's mass and gives us a little bit more delta V to play with, and it also ensures, like I say, that those dropped stages won't persist in space forever and will harmlessly burn up in Kerbin's atmosphere on re-entry. A win-win. Obviously, you've got to be careful to remember to do a prograde burn after you do a maneuver like this to make sure that you don't meet a similar fate to your spent stages, but assuming you did that, we can now get to the next part of this mission, which is doing our second Kerbin escape burn. And aside from, as I mentioned, being able to drop stages and optimizing our mass, it's also good to do multiple burns at Kerbin periapsis, because this maximizes the amount of time we spend burning as close to Kerbin periapsis as possible. And the Oberth effect states that burns are at their most efficient when burning at periapsis. So another win. It was a win-win-win when you think about it. Obviously, the Oberth effect only applies to burns like this. Inclination changes, you want to be the other way around. You want to be burning at apoapsis as much as possible. Anyway, as you can see, our escape burn is nearly at its conclusion, and then we can get to a more difficult aspect of this mission, and that is I was running into that glitch where if you make a maneuver node that influences your orbit within the Joule system, but before you actually enter the Joule system, it just causes the game to crash. And it was happening to me over and over again, and I couldn't figure out why. I kept on creating a maneuver node around this point where I'm making one now, and then I would set Tylo as my target so we can get a Tylo gravity assist to get captured at Joule for effectively free, but the game kept on stuttering and glitching and then would just crash to desktop. I wouldn't even get like an error report or anything, it would just close, like I'd pressed end task in Task Manager or something, and it was super frustrating. It's one of those glitches that I really hate, and it doesn't seem to be ever acknowledged by Squad, or if they know about it, they sure do keep quiet about it. But it's one of those things that really does compromise my enjoyment of going to Joule in this game. The way I managed to eventually get around it was by not selecting anything as my target. So I kind of had to get a Tylo encounter and then set up my Tylo gravity assist to get captured around Joule without being able to set Tylo as my target and more accurately see where the separation nodes were occurring. So it was a little bit... It was fairly inconvenient, but for some reason it just seemed to work. And yes, I was very, very liberal with the quick save feature as I approached the maneuver node, and for the rest of this mission, in fact, 'cause I got very paranoid because I didn't want to, redo the whole thing again. So that was a thing that happened. I naively thought that they might have patched this glitch because I haven't encountered it for a while. Like, I used to get it all the time, every single time I went to Joule. But the past few episodes of Life on Laythe, I've been fairly lucky, but unfortunately, this week, it reared its ugly head, and I don't know what triggers it. It just seems weird that setting Tylo as my target, or anything as my target, would cause the game to have this crash. But there you go. That's how I was able to fix it. So if you're running into this problem, I can't guarantee that this is a fix, but that seemed to fix it for me in this instance. So we've now done that burn, and we can just cruise our way around to Joule. And You know, Squad, do you know about this glitch? Please, can you patch it? I mean, I see a lot of memes on the KSP meme subreddit, and even in, like, the general Kerbal Space Program subreddit, where people say that they like this game being buggy because it makes it charming, and I disagree. I think there are, like, wholesome glitches and charming glitches that I do agree with. Things like the mohole and stuff. That's kind of cool because it's like an Easter egg level of glitch. But glitches like this, where the game just continually crashes and to desktop, and it takes ages to obviously fire the game up again. It is really frustrating because there's no real reason as to why it's happening. Or like the fuel transfer glitch. These are not wholesome glitches, and guys, you need to stop making memes saying that it's okay to have the glitches, because whilst I agree that there are some bugs in Kerbal Space Program that are charming and, you know, they add to, I guess, the charm of the game, we probably shouldn't be encouraging Squad to just not bother doing bug fixes, because there are some that are just really, really crazy annoying. And that is one of the reasons why I will always refuse to play Kerbal Space Program without the ability to quick save or quick load or, you know, revert flights. Because at some point, you will just encounter something that destroys your ship or otherwise ruins your mission through absolutely no fault of your own. Like, if I was making quick saves throughout this mission, I would have had to continually launch this thing from the launch pad over and over and over and over again just to get another opportunity to get a duel encounter without causing the game to crash to desktop. And, that's quite a long process, and I wasn't really prepared to do that. My recommendation to people when they say they don't want to play with quick saves or have that crutch is to just practice self-discipline. Just create quick saves along the way just to ensure that if the game crashes or if the Kraken gets you or something like that, then you can, you know, revert to a point where that didn't happen. But if you make a mistake or something happens that was entirely your fault, just have the self-discipline to not use a quick load, and that's how I would recommend playing KSP in, I'm doing the air quotes thing, in hard mode, if you like. So I have thought about making a career mode Let's Play and possibly doing that in hard mode, so no reverting of flights and no quick save, etc. But I would still enable quick save and all that, so I can make quick saves along flights in case I do get a bug like this where creating a maneuver node causes the game to crash to desktop. Or in my case, because I am a YouTuber, sometimes it's nice to go back to various points in the mission to take pictures that I could use for a thumbnail in the video. Or I've had cases where parts of the video didn't record properly, so I have to quickly go back to that part in the mission and just film it again. So it's useful from like a YouTuber perspective to have loads of quick saves at every single point in the mission, so I can go back and capture footage or get a thumbnail or what have you. Anyway, as you can see, we have now begun configuring this thing into its final form. You may have noticed I lowered our periapsis to within Laythe's sphere of influence, so our deadly nuclear reactors can safely They can safely crash into the atmosphere. Hopefully they burn up on re-entry, although it's probably not that healthy to have nuclear reactors disintegrate in the atmosphere. Don't think about it too hard, guys. It doesn't matter. They have now gone. Then I quickly raised our periapsis again so that we can go into a stable orbit, so that we have enough time to safely reconfigure the base into this position here. And now begins the most difficult part of this mission, and that is landing on Lowne Island. So I found the island by looking for the flag that I planted there last episode. So there it is. I'm just going to first of all time warp around to a point where it's on the daylight side of the moon, just so that we've got a bit more visibility, so we can see where we're going, and also so you guys have a nicer looking video to look at. Dark videos don't really look that good on YouTube. And then we can perform our deorbit burn, and there really isn't a secret to this, guys. I basically just made a quick save. This is now coming off the thing I just said about only using quick saves and quick loads for, you know, if you make a mistake. But in this case, I don't really know any other way of doing it other than just doing it this way, and that is I would make a quick save, deorbit myself, see what happened. I was like, okay, when I decelerated to this speed along this vector, I undershot the island by this much, so I'm going to quick load and then adjust my speed by this much and try again. And I just did that over and over and over again until I landed on Lowne Island. So that's why I'm doing loads of little adjustments here, because I kept quick loading. I was like, okay, I need to point a little bit more anti-normally upon re-entry. So yeah, there are mods that negate needing to do this, like I've no idea what it's called. It's called like atmospheric trajectories or something like that, where it shows you where you will land once you encounter the atmosphere of a planet or moon. But I don't have that mod installed. And, you know, this is how you would do it if you were on a console where you don't have access to mods. Just saying, it can be done. It can be done, guys. Just a lot of trial and error. You need a lot of patience. I wholeheartedly recommend having a nice glass of whiskey to get you through the dark times. And anyway, that's my copper compliance statement out of the way. We can get to our actual landing on Laythe surface. We can slow down the footage to real-time speed so you can get a better idea of how fast I was going upon touchdown. So, easy does it, perfect. Absolutely flawless landing. And, you know, we've managed to find a pretty flat spot of Lowne Island, so I was quite pleased with that. It was super frustrating, actually. This is like I think it's like my second or third landing attempt, but the first time I landed right on a massive slope, and it wasn't really ideal. Even though I've got that kind of leveling system with those crocodile hinges, I still couldn't really get this thing to an acceptable level of levelness, so I had to redo the landing process again, which was really, really long-winded and difficult. So don't worry, it doesn't matter. I didn't feel the need to show you all of those attempts. Maybe I'll put a montage on my second channel. I don't know yet. Don't get your hopes up. I might not do that. Anyway, moving along, we can get our rover clear of the base, and then we can deploy the alligator hinges. And, you know, whilst I'm doing this, I'm going to address the elephant in the room that someone in the comments has probably already typed, and that is, you know, you could have just used the regular landing legs and just adjusted the spring and damper strength, but I've tried that, and it just didn't seem to be as consistent as the alligator hinges. They were a bit more kind of springy, and then the whole base would start jumping up and down on the spot like a pogo stick. Like I built an SSTO a while ago, and it's actually become my second most popular video of all time, that one, that did that. It would just sort of pogo stick on the spot, and so I decided I didn't want to faff around with that this time around, so I found the alligator hinges were a better solution. I also tried using the pistons in this game as, like, you know, vertical landing legs, like feet, a bit like the Starship SN5 and 6 hop feet that you guys will know all about because you've been watching Space This Week, my Monday show that I'm now plugging 27 minutes into the video, where realistically only people that actually enjoy these videos are watching at this point. If you like this video, by the way, please like it down below. Really helps me out. Thank you. Just gotta get that plugged into the video at some point. And yeah, there you go. I've got it leveled out. I think I did a pretty good job. I think you'd be hard pressed to get it any more level given the resources I have to work with. It's a far from perfect solution in terms of leveling the base, and I have a few other ideas for other ways in which you can get a base level on uneven terrain that, you know, I might implement in a future surface colony, either in Life on Laythe or what was my other one? Take on Tylo, which is the series I vowed to do once Tylo got a facelift. I would also like to do an Elu series as well, because I love Elu, but it's quickly becoming the worst planet in the whole game just because it is so ugly compared to the others, and it's not got a lot going for it. It's just a boring rock. It's like the Mun, but like it's really difficult to get to. It'd be nice if I had some sort of things like a little moon or an asteroid orbiting it. I know KSP is kind of past the point of getting major features added to it, I think, at this point, because obviously Kerbal Space Program 2 is coming out. But hey, if there is room, squad, for a little upgrade to Elu, then it would definitely be appreciated over at Lowne Aerospace here. Now we can deploy our service harvester drill just to start filling up that ore tank for no real reason. I mean, we don't need to fill it up with ore, but I don't know, I just wanted to justify bringing the kit with me. And then we can get a scientist on EVA to start running some experiments on our little science platform just here. That boom arm is pointless. It doesn't work. It has to be out of the atmosphere to work, but it looked really cool, so that's why I brought that with me. You can also see I've got the blue ESA suit just here, and that's because I decided to color code my Kerbals suits. So the pilots have the, I guess, just the default suit, the scientists have the blue ESA suit, and the scientists have the pale blue suit. So this is like a white suit with blue accents. This is a pale blue suit with grey accents, I think. I can't even remember now. Doesn't matter. We can just move along. Now we can get into the rover and survey the area around the base. I wanted to find at least 2 surface features that came with breaking ground to justify bringing that big scanning arm. Don't worry, I'm going to play the footage back very, very fast now, so you haven't got to sit there getting bored watching me drive around for ages trying to find a surface feature to scan. I did actually get a little bit worried that perhaps Lowne Island would be too small for any surface features to spawn, but luckily I found this small Laythe rock, so we can just go ahead and scan that. It would be nice to find something a little bit bigger, so I'll be looking for something bigger, I guess. Let's see if we can find a geyser or a boulder. So there's another small rock there. Don't want that. But what is that looming ahead? That looks a lot more substantial. We can go ahead and scan that, see if we can get some science from it. There was no... I considered running all the science experiments on the back of this truck, but we are in the same biome as the main surface base, and we've already run the science experiments on that, save for the Science Junior, but I mean we can just do that when we get back, if I remember, which I don't think I did actually. So we've yet to do a Science Junior experiment, but just saying, we have the technology if we need to. But yeah, I didn't really feel the need to do it on this truck because the science data would be no different to the stuff we gathered from the lab on the main surface base. I love the little scanning arms. The little whirring and buzzing noises they make are so cute. I've realised now I talked over them, so you might have not been able to appreciate that. But if you've got the Breaking Ground DLC, then hopefully you know what I mean. Anyway, I think that's enough for our surface activity on this rover, so we can just turn around and head back to the base. Now, if you choose to download this craft file from the video description, then do make sure to disable the steering of the rear wheels, just because it makes this thing a little bit easier to control and a little bit less prone to flip, because it won't turn nearly as sharply. But I like having the steering enabled by default, because it is nice having the utility to do really sharp cornering, especially when you're trying to maneuver yourself into a position where the scanning arm can reach an interesting surface feature that you want to scan. And as we clear this little crest, there is the surface base. You can see in the distance marked in purple. That's where our ocean base is. So around 15 kilometers away. The two bases can be linked by the electric VTOL that I built last week. If you'd like to see that, then, well, I guess we're approaching the end of the video, aren't we? And there'll be a link to the full Life on Laythe playlist at the end of this video. So I won't... you can just wait, right? And then you can watch that video if you want to. But don't click off just yet, because we need to finish this mission and talk about Raid Shadow. No, this video isn't. Don't worry. But yeah, actually, to be honest, that's it. That's the mission done. The Kerbals are all aboard the base. They can settle down their new life on Laythe. Hey, that's the name of the show. And there it is. We can do a nice fade across to a cinematic time-lapse as the clouds pass over this thing. For anyone wondering, this thing's powered by RTGs, hence the lack of solar panels. And that's that. Now we can go to an end screen. On the left-hand side is a link to the full Life on Laythe playlist. The video on the right was chosen for you by YouTube's recommendation algorithm based on your viewing habits. You can see a link to subscribe and check out Patreon if you'd like to as well. Description, you'll find links to merchandise, social media, all that good shebang. Guys, thank you for watching and have an excellent day.